So, let's go ahead and get started. And that's the cover of the book. Let's see, is this gonna, yeah, good. Just making sure it would work. So, I'm gonna try and fly through about 350 years of history in about 35 minutes or so. But our objective is first to look at how the city grew, and I realize y'all are on the island, but if ever you need to drive downtown when it rains, and some of you probably have, and you're from here and you sort of know, or learned the hard way where to avoid, we're going to spend the first half of the PowerPoint looking at how and why the peninsula grew, what people used that they shouldn't have to try and fill the peninsula, what kind of engineering we used in the 19th century that was state-of-the-art then that definitely needs some upgrades, and then we'll look at the result. You know, where are we today? What's the city doing to try and make sure the city remains livable and above, you know, the tides for the future? So, you can tell by the accent right away, probably, that I'm not from here. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, originally, a great Rust Belt town. Oh, got other Ohioans in here. Okay, good. We all come here because it's lovely and the weather is awesome, and it doesn't blizzard usually. So, you know, more and more of us here all the time. So Cleveland's about 800 feet above sea level. So, you know, flooding, coastal flooding was something I wasn't familiar with. I moved here and learned the hard way that about half of downtown Charleston has a propensity to flood. And I made the mistake of renting a little carriage house right across the street from Robert Mills Manor, which incidentally just got listed as a National Register property a couple of years ago. So it's one of the only public housing estates in the U.S. to get that honor, which is pretty cool. It is located where it is because that area was low-lying and the land was cheap, which is why the apartment I could afford was right across the street. And so, you know, I got kind of tired of bicycling through that, but as a historian and someone who's always been interested in kind of how and why, it became a almost 15-year project to try and write a book documenting how the city grew. And so we'll jump in. Can you guys hear me if I move a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm loud, I yell at students all day, so if I move around, can't hear me, just let me know. But this is it's a copy of one of the earliest maps of downtown Charleston. So this is what we might call a speculative map. It's the grand model of Charleston. And so imagine your dismay if you were coming over from London and you had been granted one of these little lots, good half-acre, waterfront, you know, prime real estate. And then you got here and realized that that land is only above the tides half of the day. So, you know, this is a suggestion kind of map. And it wasn't the surveyor's faults. Most of them, you know, you can imagine the challenge of laying out a new town on a peninsula in a swamp with no benchmarks, just starting from scratch. So that area is about 350-ish acres. It's not huge. I don't think that, yeah, it does work, good. So that hydra over on this side, this is Daniels Creek, which is now the market. And the big creek over on the left is Water Street, which used to be Van Drost or Vanderhorst Creek. And then on the back side of the town, that square right in the middle, that's the intersection of Meeting and Broad Street. So even though you've got hundreds of lots that look like good buildable lots, the reality was so much of that was low-lying that early Charlestonians ended up just building between those two creeks, walling it off. So original Charlestown is fairly tiny, and really what determines where we build and where we live is how much of the city was underwater. So this map, which some of y'all have probably seen, it's one of the earliest good maps of what the city actually looked like. It's circa 1711. So up at the top, that triangular feature, that's the intersection of Meeting and Broad. And down at the bottom is the Cooper River with a pretty substantial half-mile-long seawall. So it's obviously for fortifications. You can see the gun emplacement sticking off of it, but it was at least 6 foot high, got rebuilt multiple times. So it acted as a fortress, and it also kept the Cooper River out of East Bay Street. So everybody who could afford to purchased the lots that were high and dry on that bluff on the Cooper River. And only after the city got too crowded and burned repeatedly did they start slowly working their way further and further out, north, south, east, and west, literally, from that original walled area. And people who could afford it built on high ground. And people who could afford it elevated their properties on these proper English raised basements. So the house on the screen is 11 Church Street. It's outside of that walled area, and you can tell it was much closer to the water when it was built than it is now by the fact that it has that high raised basement. So can you excavate a basement in Charleston? Kind of, and it entirely depends where your house is located. Most of downtown Charleston, the water table is so close to the surface that if you dig a post hole about 3 foot deep, it's going to start perking up water. And that, of course, was a challenge, but it also was a really big challenge for trying to tap wells for clean water supplies. This would have been a pretty dangerous, difficult place, a beautiful but difficult coast to try and habitate. So this house, you can see, has windows out the front, but that's really just to keep people off of that property. It's almost like a beach house on stilts, but sort of hidden with a facade. That area was not supposed to be Airbnbs down in that basement or college rentals for kids who don't know any better. It was supposed to be storage and sacrificial space because there was always that chance that a hurricane or even a bad rain was going to flood those spaces. So one of the other reasons we flood, besides just natural situation of being low-lying, is because we used a lot of unsanitary and ineffectual fill materials. So Charlestown, it's a cool city, does not have any bedrock. You can drive piles all day and not hit any stone. We didn't start quarrying stone in the upstate until the 19th century. So early Charlestonians, they're kind of struggling. They're using literal pluff mud, they're using brickbats and construction debris, they're using, it's gross, but we have to talk about it, slaughterhouse remains, rice chaff, pretty much any part of an animal you could have used for something else, literal garbage. Obviously, that stuff's going to biodegrade and sink over time. So before engineers got involved, it was really up to private owners to use whatever they felt like filling. And no offense to any developers or retired developers in the room, but speculative development, it's not that you're not doing a good job, but you're hoping people are going to buy that property. It's not quite the same as the homeowner hounding you and watching everything that you do. So as an example, along the Cooper River, we had this interesting situation called wharfing out. And that term was coined by a Boston historian. They had a similar phenomenon where you've got the seawall picked out in blue, and the Cooper River laps right up against that, and you have wharfs sticking out into the river. And between that, you have the docks, the water where the ships are pulling up to the city to do business. So not only are the one or two drains that didn't drain very well terminating out into those docks, people are just indiscriminately throwing garbage, wrecked carriages, kind of anything they can't sell into those docks. Add to that all the skunk stuff coming in and off of ships getting dumped, and the further problem of the tide pushing silt into those docks constantly. Before you could build a cofferdam and get a dredge machine, your only option was to build a cofferdam and manually bail that out and try and excavate all the silt, which even with enslaved labor and people to exploit was really, really difficult and unsanitary. So what folks ended up doing instead is just giving up, building their wharfs further out into the river, and then filling what was left of that dock and putting warehouses on top of it. So it's gradual and it's accidental, and it's really up to whoever owns that wharf to do a good job or not, as the case may be. So when you head down East Bay and you're walking to Waterfront Park, you've probably noticed that almost every street goes downhill towards the river. And most of them are named, Adger's Wharf or Boyce's Wharf. That's why. That's obviously where the ships used to dock. This is one of my favorite plats, and I have a lot of favorite plats, but this is like top 3 favorite plats, surveyed right after the American Revolution. And this is for South Adger's Wharf. So that big house right on the corner with the hip roof, it's still there. It's got a cool cast iron storefront, cobblestone street. So what you're looking at, and I know it's a little tough in the back, but you can see the tall ships, and you can see the original edge of the city right there. And so over time, we just keep building those wharfs further out. And you can see if you've got good eyes that it's actually built almost like a log cabin. They would essentially take pine piles and half lap the corners, almost again like you would build a cabin. They would sink those into the Cooper River, try and underpin them, and then backfill them with sand and brick and whatever they had. So it's substantial fill. It's enough to be able to take a 700-pound rice barrel off and on a ship, but definitely not with like a concrete footer under it. So give it a couple hundred years, all of that has slowly settled. And then you got the private development. So we got to give, homeowners and speculative developers some credit. It's not their fault there wasn't a lot of local material. We never had enough brick in the colonial era because we were constantly needing to use it for seawall repair and fortifications. And the other struggle is not everybody could afford high land. So as downtown Charleston, the little walled city, slowly expands, we knock down the walls, we build suburbs, pretty much the same way we expand through Mount Pleasant out to Daniel Island today. And two of the first examples of that, these new neighborhoods, are Charleston Village, which is where College of Charleston is located, and Hampstead Village, which the Rev. Moore people in the room are familiar with that neighborhood. There was a couple important gun emplacements up there. Today, it's just called the East Side. So if you've seen the cigar factory or been to a wedding, that building is built on Hampstead Hill, the one high spot in that neighborhood. So I put some little arrows in to show you where those two neighborhoods are located. They're right downtown. They're not on the neck up by the cemeteries. These are some of the first kind of expansions. So Charleston is an interesting one. It's conveniently close to the dense older part of the city, but the lots are a little bit larger. The Charleston family essentially subdivided it, a couple hundred nice suburban lots. But just like the first map I showed y'all, a lot of those lots only exist on paper. So with really good eyes, you can see there's a bunch of squiggly marks. Those are basically the topo lines to show you what's buildable and what's not. So at least they were honest when they were mapping this part of the city. The blue circle or block down in the bottom is Colonial Lake. So originally that lake, which is pretty famous, and I'm sure y'all have seen it, that was part of the Ashley River. And then over time it gets impounded as a mill pond, and then we fill everything around it and convert it into a pretty Victorian reflecting pond. So it's kind of a vestige of how much further the water used to claim into the city. The blue square up at the top, I'm going to read you a fun quote it's one of my favorite quotes in the entire long, boring book, but those two lots, right in the middle of downtown, here is an advertisement for them when they're listed for sale in 1783. I'm going to read it to you in case it's tough to read. So, these are speculative lots. This is, vacant land that you can buy to build a house on, and somebody did. There's a big, pretty Greek revival house there on that corner today. So it's lots 17 and 18, and they're big, 212 by 242 feet. It's a good chunk of land for downtown. Bounded north to south on the corner of Pitt and Wentworth Street. They are the highest lots on the most beautiful situation within the lines of Charleston, meaning, close to the city. It's lately been laid out in a garden by Joseph Atkinson. He's the speculative developer. And then it's been enriched by upwards of 1,000 cartloads of dung, because that's cheap and we have a lot of it, because we have a lot of horses and cows, and then it gets better. Besides the bodies of upwards of 800 Waldeckers, Hessians, and British, who were fortunate enough to escape being witness to the approaching disgrace of their arms. That is a really, really angry patriot that's basically sorry, not sorry about, selling a low lot that is a glorified cemetery, capping it with dung, capping that with pluff mud, and then calling it a residential building lot. And this is why Charleston floods and why it's probably the most haunted city in the entire country. And I don't know the homeowner. I'm sure they have no idea. Because that's not a normal cemetery. It's not like they're putting up headstones or anything. So that's probably the most egregious quote in the PowerPoint. And then the city starts getting involved. So we become the city of Charleston in 1783. And if you're on the outskirts, If you're outside of the incorporated area, you can still use bodies or dung or hooves or whatever. But if you're in downtown Charleston, in the city proper, we did have city civil engineers, and they were paying attention. And one of their main motivations for asking homeowners to fill their lots was public safety and health. But again, homeowners, they don't always have the budget. I love a copper roof. It's historically accurate. I'm never going to have one. You know, there's always expectation in reality. And the same is true for most of our civic projects. So some of our good city-backed projects to sort of deal with flooding, make the city more buildable, is White Point Garden and the High Battery, East Battery. So as early as 1785, the city government, they're actually selling lottery tickets to try and get proceeds to build what's now East Battery. They try and use pine piles, and it washes away repeatedly. And finally, they switched to stone, and the base of that wall has been holding strong since they finished it in 1818. So eventually, they spent the money, did it right. It did have a little bit of damage. So the image on y'all's right is a cross-section of the High Battery seawall right after the hurricane of 1854 took the top half of it off. So the city civil engineer, governments never learn, he recommended elevating it, rebuilding it anyway. Let's take this moment and add 3 foot to the height of it. And the city said, yeah, that's a good idea, tax revenue is low, we'll compromise and raise it a foot. And it's still, you know, we get a hurricane, water crests over it, it turns East Bay into a bathtub. So not a new problem, I guess is the consolation. And White Point, down at the end of the peninsula, great Victorian sort of strolling garden, pleasure garden, that dates to 1836. If you were to fast forward, and I have a much longer version with more visuals, so I'm trying to summarize it for you. But if you were to jump back in time and stand in what's now White Point Garden in 1780, there would have been gun emplacements and oyster shells just bleached on the beach and underwater at high tide. That's why it's called White Point. And there is that battery seawall today. Again, finished in 1818, repaired once massively in 1854, and otherwise still kind of the main line of defense for all those beautiful houses when we get a hurricane. Also, for those of y'all who like to walk around downtown, architectural styles are fairly easy to date. I make kids memorize all of it. They have a test tomorrow, incidentally. But another way to date Charleston is thinking about what land existed and what didn't. So the Battery, its earliest houses are right about 1825. Before the wall is finished, it's impossible to build there. There we go. Did I skip one? No, okay. So next up is our other main line of defense, our tidal drains. And these are pretty fascinating engineering for the 1830s, updated in the 1850s. So the way these are supposed to work, I stole a diagram from Judith Carney's rice plantation research, very similar to the way the rice dikes, the water control works on a wetlands plantation. So essentially, we had, and they're still functioning, massive tidal drains. Some are only 3 foot, some are almost 6 foot in diameter, and they run kind of down the spine of the peninsula, down Meeting Street, south to north. And then there's spurs that run downhill towards the rivers. They're fitted at the end historically with big cypress tidal gates. And the way they were supposed to work is you could control water flow, just like a plantation. So if you wanted to always keep some water in those drains, you would just close the doors when the tide was coming in. And the main reason for doing that was our fire wells were in the base of those drains. So if you wanted to have water supply, that was the main way to do it before you could pipe it in. If you knew a storm was coming, or you knew it was going to be a high tide and a full moon and the water was going to be worse, you could wait for dead low tide, flush everything that was in the drains out, close those gates, and use them almost like a reservoir so that all of the rainwater would have somewhere to go. It's ingenious, except when it rains at high tide and water, some of you have seen this, backs right up through those drains because it's following the path of least resistance right into the areas that we filled. So, you know, they were fascinating. By 1850, some of our mayors recognized that they had spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars on those, and they were never going to work properly. Yet, we still use them, because when you're low, unless you build a levee, there's really not a lot you can do. Worst job in Charleston. So this is an inspector whose job it is to scuttle through those drains and look for cave-ins. Because occasionally, out of sight, out of mind, but think about all the salt water and, horse urine for 200 years down in that drain, eating all of the brick mortar. So you can see there's voids where there should be mortar, which means eventually those things can cave in. So he's not only having to scuttle through there subterranean, if it rains or the tide comes in, those things will fill up completely with water. So the sludge line is the typical tide line. But again, with rain, that becomes a death trap. So brave person. Here's another fun quote about things we used to fill that we shouldn't have. Charleston again, which today is such a pretty, expensive neighborhood. But they were using slaughterhouse remains, rice chaff, sawdust, animal carcasses. City of Charleston was. So Buffane Street and Wentworth Street flood all the time. The city's response in the 1830s was to have the scavengers, i.e. the garbage truck cart drivers, get all the street sweepings and garbage from the city and throw it in the streets. And then cap it with sand and call it done. So, bless you. So, this is very kind of Victorian language, but basically, this is like a letter to the editor, and it's a resident on Buffane who's really mad. Is the gentleman aware of what the city rubbish consists of? Has he ever actually looked? Dead dogs, cats, pigs, rats, aided by as much decayed vegetable matter as would ensure exhalations quite sufficient to poison the air of the city, which is a really flowery way of saying there's rotting carcasses in the street. So it's not only a nuisance and offensive, in this period, there's no germ theory yet. They don't understand the mosquito vector. They just recognize that low-lying areas with a lot of garbage, you're more likely to get sick. They're unsanitary. So he's not just inconvenienced, he's worried that the gas, the miasmas coming off of that are gonna make him sick. He complained multiple times. City council just kind of, thank you for your statement, kept dumping. Incidentally, that block still floods. So moving forward, we start to get a little bit more modern. This is Charleston in 1872, and you can see up at the top some of those mill ponds that used to be part of the Ashland River, and you can see the evidence of the wharfing out down there at the base. So, constantly looming further and further out into the Cooper River. So Colonial Lake is an interesting one, because really it's one of our only mill ponds that hasn't been completely filled. So there it is in 1872, and if you look closely, you can see there's a couple houses in the lake. The city, for a good minute, was taking all of the garbage, all the street sweepings, and dumping it in the lake with the intention of filling it enough to subdivide it for building lots. Everybody complained a lot because of the smell. And so in 1881, the city cut their losses, gave up, and turned it into a pleasure garden, which is why there's a bunch of really nice post-1880 Victorians around that lake. Nobody wanted to live there prior to, the changing point. Today, it's landlocked by the Sergeant Jasper, which has been replaced by the big fancy new neoclassical Jasper apartment buildings, all on fill. Then there's Murray Boulevard, the low battery. So it's a great project, it's 20th century, it uses concrete, steel rebar, it's well designed. The problem with this project is it hit at the worst possible time. The first phase goes pretty well. The second phase is underway during World War I. They have a material shortage and a labor shortage. And it came to light in 2014 when Cummings and McCready engineering firm did some assessments. So a lady was jogging down Murray Boulevard and the river started gushing through the sidewalk because the rebar had started to rust out because all the salt water getting into the concrete. So the city hired some engineers, and the terrifying thing is the construction drawings called for 80-foot piles, preferably concrete. Some of them were not only pine, but they were only 20 feet, holding up a whole shelf of a concrete street. Just material shortages, people cut corners, and we're still having to deal with that today. Another fun one that floods sometimes is Lockwood Boulevard, because it used to be causeways, you know, kind of like when you drive to Folly Beach or Isle of Palms. And so there's some kids racing go-karts, a hobby I wish we still had downtown because it would be fun. So today, that's basically under modern Lockwood Boulevard. West Point Mill Building does survive, and it's a wedding venue owned by the city. So that's that area historically. And that's that area by about 1950. So we had developed almost every bit of land we could, and that's why MUSC, the medical district, is also in a floodplain. That's one of the only areas that was left to build. So you start moving into the modern era and doing some of the where are we today slides. So over time, Charleston, while we have really good preservation rules, we did a good bit of urban renewal. And most of the houses that we ripped down were working class houses in low-lying areas. And as a preservationist, I hate looking at a scene like this and thinking about those houses getting destroyed. That's the kind of houses we're talking about. Today we'd save those, of course. But what you can't tell in the picture, is you kind of can, they kept paving the street over and over again because it flooded. This is down by the Harris Teeter, which still always floods. And you can see how the houses are basically lower than the street because they predate the street. Those houses in the 40s still didn't have electric and didn't have running water. So you can imagine if your water source is still a privy and that's flooding all the time with salt water, that would have been one of the worst parts of the city to live in. And now we pay big bucks for waterfront properties. So that area got demolished. They built public housing. That in turn got demolished because during Hurricane Hugo, it flooded 9 foot deep. And today they're developing it as Gadsden Borough Park, and that's where the International African American Museum is that's about to open. So, you know, that part of the city is changing, but it still floods all the time, and it probably always will. I bike to the Harris Teeter, and it used to be fine, but now there's all this new construction, and so, like, you can't avoid the flood water. And I'm on a bike, I can get a new chain, but I'm thinking to myself, 1.2 million for a lovely condo that you can't drive to and from. Y'all were smart. Daniel Island is, you know, developed pretty well. Okay, so for our epilogue, we don't fill a lot in Charleston anymore, and this is true for the Sea Islands as well, because today it's not impossible, but it is pretty difficult to get wetlands permits. So the Army Corps of Engineers has to make sure you're not doing anything that's going to sink. And in theory, they want to make sure that you're not doing damage to important ecological sites or historic sites. But before the 1960s and 70s came, when we started cracking down, we'd already filled and created almost twice as much technically buildable land on the peninsula than existed when people first started developing and documenting Charleston. Our tidal drains still function. They still occasionally cave in. They still back up with seawater on a regular basis. We're getting high tides and storms. We're constantly developing denser and denser because it's a beautiful place and everybody wants to be in downtown Charleston. So let's just do a couple slides of how much we've grown. That blue line shows you where the Cooper River used to come up. So that's East Bay Street. That little brick thing all by itself, you guys have probably seen that cool facade surrounded by BMWs over at the Ports Authority. That's Union Pier that's been in the news that they're about to redevelop. So if you could jump back to the 1850s, that's Bennett's Rice Mill, and it's surrounded by mill ponds that are reclaimed out of the Cooper River. And below that is some of that early accidental wharfing out that we talked about at the beginning. Another spot, really one of the only spots, unless you excavate, that you can still see our original seawall today is in the basement of the old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. So, you know, fun stuff. That building had been open to the public. It had been City Hall for a minute, all kinds of important activities. And they had redone the floors repeatedly. And it wasn't until the 1960s that somebody by accident found the half moon hidden in plain sight in the basement. And they scrambled to do archaeology. And anyone who's toured it knows it still fills up with water and they constantly have to pump it. So I know it's tough to see, but that arrow shows you the Exchange building, a good 3.5 blocks away from the river. So that building makes no sense anymore because we've ruined its context and built behind it. But your first thing you would have seen when you boated into Charleston would have been that building. And until post-Rev War, you could dock right in front of it. This is a fun one, Chisholm House. So this is a Library of Congress photo, 1865. So that is a Confederate submersible, like little David sitting, it's not the Hunley, it's similar to the Hunley. Basically beached, and you just gotta wait for high tide so that you can drag it out and get back in it. So that house, Chisholm House, was owned by the Chisholm family, who owned the rice mill right next to Colonial Lake. And what I like about this picture, besides the setup, is you can see that crib work construction we were talking about earlier. So basically, it's his own little bulwark to keep the house from floating away. And today it's completely landlocked and doesn't have the cool view of the river from the awesome portico anymore. Looks at some cute 1920s houses instead. Okay, so this was only available for a minute because archaeology downtown is a challenge and you can't leave the street ripped up forever. But in 08 and 09, College Charleston and various preservationists got a chance to excavate, and they were looking for more remains of that original seawall. We knew roughly where it was, but not how big it was or how thick it was. So there it is. If you get a chance, there's a parking lot there, and the city paid to have a brick triangle put in the parking lot so that you can see where the waterfront used to be. But I love this because imagine a real estate advertisement where you're buying a lot and it comes with a fortification with a couple thousand bricks on it. And you can, build a house out of it, scrape it, do whatever you want. So we got ads for that. We've got these great plats. And just a couple feet under East Bay Street, there it still is. And this is one of my favorite pictures for a couple reasons. The pink brick, that's 1690s stuff. That's probably handmade downtown, under-fired, build it quick. The circular brick that's more gray, that's one of the tidal drains we were talking about. Can you imagine you're going about your business and you're a mason and you're building this drain and suddenly you hit 6 foot of solid brick and there's no jackhammers and you just have to manually pickaxe through that? And then the 1960s came along and the water department blew right through there to run that much more uniform line. So, again, they were probably cursing and really frustrated and didn't even realize that they were obliterating a cool 1690s piece of archaeology, but that's okay. So always want to be careful when you head down to MUSC. Both the east and the west end of Calhoun Street still flood. Maps from the Rev War show that there was only a couple hundred feet of high land at Calhoun, basically where Marion Square is today, and everything next to it would have been marsh and kind of naturally fortified. Also, tourists and college kids, they don't know when they try and drive through, and sometimes it's pretty deep. College kids swim in it. I wouldn't recommend it. It's like not treated water, and there's all kinds of stuff in those drains, and it backs right up into the street. But it's really easy to figure out where to avoid. All you have to do is look at a historic map. So one of the last places we filled is over by the Citadel. So the new Citadel campus from the 1920s. And the River Dog Stadium and Fishburne Street. So that was city fill. They called it sanitary landfill because they used garbage, but they pulled all of the diapers and bodies and debris and stuff like that out. But they didn't think twice in the 50s and 60s about like paint cans and creosote treated logs. Just threw it all out there into the marsh. So our last couple things to mention is it's not news. Anybody who's been downtown knows we've got flooding problems. And the city's not ignoring it, and they're definitely having to get more proactive as flooding gets worse. Also, as folks are moving, when you live in a place, you get used to the good and the bad of a place. When you buy a house on the Battery and it costs like $300,000 a year to insure, you're righteously indignant when the street keeps flooding. So, the city is learning. So our seawall is great until Hurricane Matthew or Ida or Florence crests over that wall. So private homeowners lately have been doing a lot to try and weatherproof their houses. Now the city has to do their job to try and keep the streets from flooding. So just a couple of setting visuals. This is the construction drawings for Murray Boulevard, the low battery. So it's not only a new seawall, it created 47 acres of new building lots. So lots of arts and crafts, kind of late Victorian stuff. That's what it looked like in 2016, which wasn't even that bad of a storm. Bad. They're all bad, but I mean, it was category 1. It wasn't that bad in the great scheme of things. And you can see that the water literally stops where the fill stops. I mean, water remembers its path. So what the city's doing now, they've done a really good job trying to elevate the high battery, and they also took that opportunity to reinforce the intersection of the old and the new battery, where the pine piles we talked about were kind of floating and not deep enough. So you can see them building a little seawall, temporary, to drive concrete piles to reinforce that part of the city. And then there's the tidal drains. So they still work, and we're kind of stuck with them, but the city has spent hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, creating these new tidal drain pumping stations. Y'all ever been in the market when it floods? Yeah. So it probably, like the engineers know this, they were honest about it. It's probably always gonna flood, but now it drains about 6 times quicker than it used to. Because below all the old drains, they've put in a massive 10-foot diameter tube. And it ties to all of these shafts in the market to take the water down. There's huge centrifugal pumps down there that push the water out into the Cooper River. Anybody see a problem with that? Yeah, at high tide it just comes right back in as fast as you can pump it. So it's not that the engineers didn't know any better, they just recognized that this would make things drain quicker and it was cheaper than building like a huge new seawall, which we're about to do. So here's a cool view of one of the new drainage tunnels. So Crosstown doesn't flood as bad anymore. President Street doesn't flood as bad because there's all that cool subterranean infrastructure. So when you go across, like for almost 2 years, when you drive across the Ashley River bridges, you could see all those big cranes. That was them sinking the huge new drainage shaft. And then there's homeowners taking matters into their own hands, elevating their houses, trying to get their ductwork a little bit higher up into the house. That's expensive, and you still have to be able to get to and from the house. So it's going to take a concerted kind of long-term effort. So one other thing worth mentioning, our Board of Architecture used to be really particular. They didn't want you elevating your houses because they didn't want a beach house on stilts effect, where everything's 2 stories and then boom, one house shoots up. In the last 2 or 3 years, they've had to backtrack, and they're recognizing that a house can only flood so many times before the owner gives up. So this one on Colonial Lake was one of the first trial runs where the city allowed a homeowner to elevate, and it looked great. The architect did an awesome job. You'd never even know, unless you were really looking at the foundation down the side, that it had ever been altered. So things to be aware of, all you need to do before you come downtown is look at a map. Don't be college kids with John boats going down Reading America. They create a wake too, and then it goes in everybody's house, which is really annoying. Probably don't buy gas at the Shell station at King and Eugene after a bad rainstorm, because that intersection, that car is bobbing. It's not driving. That intersection gets 3.5 foot deep, not even during a hurricane. So here's where we're at now, and $2 billion is a big price tag with the city, and the Army Corps of Engineers are actively trying to plan for the future. That is not a Charleston rendering. That's from Louisiana, and the preservation groups are like, it better not look like that. They're really paranoid, because you don't want to be, at the Edmonston-Alston house looking out at Fort Sumter and see this kind of seawall. The counterpoint is, without some kind of seawall, there are no houses to view anything from anymore. So it's a whole lot easier to be me criticizing stuff engineers did in the past than coming up with the money to fix it. But be paying attention to Union Pier, all that new development, be paying attention to the new seawall. Daniel Island is in pretty good shape. downtown Charleston's definitely gonna have to get serious pretty soon. So my last slide is my favorite map. If you Google Halsey map, you can find it for free on Preservation Society's website. And I think it's a great stopping point, because we started with a map that made Charleston look like it was completely buildable on paper in 1672. And here we've got a comparison between a Google map, which makes it look like the peninsula is buildable, and the Halsey map, made in 1949, that shows you reality in blue versus original high ground. So check it out. If you want to download it, you can actually zoom in and it'll show you fire paths and mention some of the creeks. Great resource, and you can trust it because it was made in the 40s by a bunch of engineers who worked for the city who had to fix all the drainage. So they knew what they were doing. All right, so I went a little long, but I left 10 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir.
I'm new in the area. Is there anything on Drum Island?
Yes, not so, historically not much. And basically now it's where they put all the dredge spoil. So historically, a wharf owner would be responsible for dredging their own dock. In the 1880s, the US government started doing mega dredging so that they could create the big Navy base. And still we have to constantly dredge that so we get the container ships through. So they pump all that and they put it on Drum Island. And Plum Island is where the sewage treatment facility is.
How do you get to Drum Island?
You can't. You can illegally kayak out there, but there's no bridge or anything. There is actually a little further up, there's an island called Laurel Island that used to have a bunch of big War of 1812 era magazines on it. And they're about to develop that as a new planned urban development. So that one has like a little land bridge. Yeah. Yes.
What do you think of the idea of putting the new Charleston Coliseum on Drum Island?
Huh. Well, I mean, it's high and it's not gonna flood. It would just be a matter of, yeah, it would be a matter of having a proper off point on the peninsula that wouldn't flood.
The biggest problem, though, is you can't build on a dredge line. That's why the whole south end of Dane Island isn't buildable. Because dredge material, it may seem hard, but any kind of small earthquake even will liquefy that entire.
And that's important. We didn't even talk about the earthquake. Like, we have constant seismic activity, which, you know, dredge, like you mentioned, or all the garbage they used to fill, they didn't compact that. It's just naturally constantly settling. So to build on it, if you could even get the permits, you'd have to float a sea of concrete piles to try and build on it. It's high, but another problem we have is this thing called subsidence, which is basically where land accretes back out from below. So not only will bad fill sink, but even naturally occurring peninsulas have this tendency to kind of wash out at the base. It's a challenging place to develop, that's for sure.
So if you were developing in charge of the Union Pier project, what would you lay down there so that people could build these 14-story?
Because I'm a preservationist, I would say they don't need to be building anything that big there. I mean, I would say the city of Charleston bought all that land in the 19-teens to create the Port Utilities Commission, and they bought it with our money. And then the Depression hit, and they gave that land to the state. So it's, you know, still public land. I think it would be really cool to be smart about it. You know, maybe have some water access for kayaks or small boats, smaller scale residential development. Because just like the old exchange is now landlocked, all those people in those really expensive condos, you know, right next to the Harris Teeter, they're about to be landlocked too. We're just constantly doing that. So I would like to see a really cool garden and public water access and historic signage. Anybody else? Yes.
What kind of confidence do you have in this massive drainage project that the city has been going?
I think living downtown and biking downtown, it does dissipate the flooding much more quickly. So I have confidence that it does what it's supposed to, but it's definitely not going to stop flooding. And so one of the struggles with the huge new, maybe 2 billion, maybe more seawall is they haven't talked about how high it's going to be, or can only push it so far out because the rivers are international shipping channels. And so there's a concern for people who live a little further up the neck that water's got to go somewhere, and it might kind of create a wake that pushes water further up the rivers. And so I have confidence it works pretty well now, but I'm not sure how it's going to interface with the new seawall. Again, it's really easy to complain about it. I have the easy job. Yes, sir.
Well, given the 300 years of mishaps that you've talked about, what gives you any confidence there's the political will to A, spend that much money, and B, get it right?
Getting it right is going to be a challenge because any coastal development is really, really complicated. Boston has flooding problems, Maryland, places like Venice, they've spent billions to create those cool new flood pop-up gates. It can be done. People have been building in beautiful places they shouldn't since the beginning of time. I think the struggle is going to be the cost, but I think there's so much money in Charleston at this point, people aren't going to be willing to give up on it. Also, it hasn't happened yet, but there's been a push for about a decade now to try and make Charleston a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is very difficult to do because you have to prove a place has international significance. If you can prove it's internationally significant, then sometimes UNESCO will kick money and at least planning help. So I think there's the will. It's just we kind of need to see the final price tag.
I mean, I'm already hearing local politicians, we're not talking people in Columbia, local politicians, saying, why the hell should we spend that much money downtown?
I mean, there is that, because City of Charleston includes y'all, it includes Daniel Island and parts of James Island. The counter argument would be West Ashley and James Island flood too. Everybody needs drainage infrastructure. It's hard to justify why one person gets it. I mean, I'm, prejudiced because I live downtown, but it also has really important architecture in it. So I think every homeowner deserves money, their fair tax money, but downtown has some pretty important irreplaceable built environment. There's kind of an argument going, and it'll never happen, that maybe we shouldn't have annexed all these places and we should have small governments, but little downtown Charleston could never pay to fix this themselves, that's for sure. It's gonna be not a slow motion train wreck, but it's gonna take a while to fix this problem for sure. Yes, sir.
So in that line, Daniel Island exists because Charleston exists. There is no Daniel Island without Charleston. As a historian, as a national look into the future, if we don't do some combination of pumps, seawall, and living coastline, what's Charleston going to look like without those things?
I mean, it's going to be increasingly unlivable. The houses that are built on high ground, the early houses on high ground, they've withstood storms for hundreds of years at this point. And will probably continue to do so, but our infrastructure is crumbling from underneath. I think it's really important, and no one wants to do this, but like you said, living coastlines, permeable surfaces are really, really important. And I don't think it should still be legal to hardscape driveways in areas that flood. So we live in the east side, and our house is FEMA compliant because it's a new build in the historic district, and we got permission to go higher than base flood elevation because it's two historians who study disasters, and we're like, I'd like this to be here when I'm 80. So we got permission to go higher, and we masked it with the traditional raised basement. So they let us do it because it looks like it's supposed to, and we have a gravel driveway that we excavated by hand because we're ridiculous and should have rented a Bobcat. It's 8 inches deep, gravel. And our yard has never had any standing water because we spent a bunch of time to try and like respond to the fact that it's low lying. So what it's gonna look like without a comprehensive plan, not good, would be the short answer. And I think you're right, we need a combination of like local initiative drainage, better streets that, permeate better, and probably some kind of new seawall. I'm not going anywhere. I'm confident it's gonna exist downtown, hopefully for the rest of my life, which hopefully is long, but 100 years from now, who knows? Yeah. On that depressing note, thanks for your patience, everybody.